Typically, when we do our lectures on sensation and perception, we start with vision because humans are a highly visual animal. Vision is a big part of our stimulation, our perception, and a fair amount of brain area is dedicated to the processing of vision in human beings, very different than some other mammals like rats and so forth, where they have much more dedicated to olfaction, that is smell. But let's talk about first the anatomy of the eye. Each part of the eye, of course, contributes to transforming light waves into neural signals. So light waves enter here, of course, and by the time things are going on here and go out the optic nerve, what's going on is actually neural stimulation or electrical stimulation. So the cornea is the first part that light sort of comes into contact with. The cornea is the outermost layer of the eye, and it's basically a thin, kind of clear membrane which has a tendency to bend light inward so that it begins to get focused back here on the back of the eye, an area called the retina. And in fact, one of the things I'm going to try to convince you of is the main job of our visual system is to provide a very clear, sort of focused image on the back here of the retina, and in particular, one particular spot called the fovea, which is kind of the center of the retina where our vision is kind of the most acute. So I'll describe that as we go along, but I want you to remember that largely what we're trying to do when we see is have the light waves hit just at the right spot in the retina here, that we're able to pick up the sort of clearest picture. Next we go to the pupil. The pupil is the opening for light waves to enter the eye. And the pupil is interesting in that its size changes depending on the brightness of the environment. So that when it's dim in our environment, our pupil opens wide to let light in. But when it's really bright, our pupil tends to become smaller, it contracts to keep some of that light out. It's also the case that when we're doing things like when we're looking at something we tend to like, we're more likely to dilate our pupil, that is, it opens up more, than when we are looking at something that's much more neutral in terms of its emotional valence. We also have the iris here, which is the pigmented portion of the eye. And the muscles adjust the size of the pupil, often are here in the iris as well, and this expands or contracts as light conditions change. The lens itself, which is shown right here, focuses light to fall onto the retina. So that's largely what the lens is doing, is making sure that this is moving around and focusing perfectly right here on the retina. So it actually changes its shape, as we'll see, depending on where you're trying to focus. And this ability of the lens to change shape so that it can show just the right image on the back here of the retina is called accommodation. So when we're focusing close, that lens tends to flatten, basically. On the other hand, if we're focusing far away, that lens tends to contract. Here's the retina, as we mentioned before. It's this kind of multi-layered collection of neurons on the back of the eye. This contains visual receptors which convert the light signals into neural signals. And one particular part, although it's not shown here, is called the fovea. That's the exact center of the retina, and this contains lots and lots of receptor cells that are specialized for fine detail and color vision. This is the place where acuity, that is the ability to see best, is highest. So if you're trying to examine, some instructions to put together a new piece of equipment, for example, you're trying to foveate on those instructions. That is, you want the information that you're looking at to fall directly on your fovea. Back there on that retina, in fact, I'll pop back here as we describe the retina, we talked about visual receptors. It turns out there's two major types of visual receptors. Those are the rods and the cones, and they look something like this. You can see these rods are kind of shaped like a rod. Yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch, but deal with it. It's a rod. And these things are kind of shaped like cones. You'll also notice that there are three types of cones. There's shortwave cones that are kind of really sensitive to things that look kind of in the bluish range. There's middle wave cones that are sensitive to things in kind of green, yellow area. And then there's long wave cones that are sensitive to things that are more reddish. There's also, after that, the optic nerve. That's a set of bundle of fibers that transmit visual signals to the brain, and it consists of axons that leave the eye at a spot known as the optic disc. Here there are no rods and cones. There's only these axons within the optic disc, so each eye has a blind spot. It's an area where we actually can't get visual signals. The thing is, our rest of our cognitive system enables, and visual perceptual system enables us to kind of fill in the blanks so we don't even notice it as we're looking at it. So let's talk a little bit about light and the visual spectrum. It actually, basically the light that we see determines, or the light that impinges on our retinas, in addition to the knowledge that we use to make sense of things, help determine what we see. We can think of each visual stimulus as a wave of electromagnetic energy. And this electromagnetic energy produces three characteristics: hue, brightness, and saturation. You'll notice two components here: the wavelength, that's the distance from the peak of one wave to the peak of another wave. And you'll also notice another component called the amplitude. The amplitude is simply the height of that wave. You can see when we look here, wavelengths tend to determine the hue of something, that is the color of something. So short wavelengths tend to be in the bluish range. Long wavelengths tend to be in the reddish range. Amplitudes tend to determine the brightness of something, so that a small amplitude shows something that's pretty dim, pretty dull, and so forth, whereas large amplitudes tend to show something that's pretty bright. So when we turn up, the intensity or turn up the lights, basically what we're doing is seeing that amplitude spike. When we turn down, we're doing exactly the opposite. When we switch from blue to red, what we're seeing is the wavelengths that are impinging on our retina are simply expanding. They're getting longer. That's what that color portends. And you can see this, in fact, that there are different wavelengths for different hues. And remember, one of the things I mentioned is that it's the job of the lens to make sure that stimuli are focused perfectly on the back of our retinas. In order to do that, it makes it more convex or concave, makes the lens more convex or more concave, depending on the wavelength. So here you can see that we've got a very short wavelength with the blue, and that makes our eyes accommodate to a very short wavelength. But then right next to it, we've got this red here, and that is a very long wavelength. If we try to look at both of these things at the same time, remember we're trying to focus that wavelength on the back of the retina. What's happening is we're trying to do these two things at the same time. And if you look at this for any period of time, you will notice that your eyes get really fatigued. And they're getting really fatigued simply because your lens is becoming more concave, more convex, more concave, more convex, more concave, more convex. And interestingly, this creates a phenomenon called stereopsis, or stereopsis, there we go. And stereopsis is this notion of your eyes going back and forth, going back and forth, going back and forth, and in particular, your lens doing that, becoming convex, concave, convex, concave, and so forth. So we've talked about wavelength, and we've talked about amplitude a little bit. Boy, my eyes are going buggy after doing that. But that's the price we pay for teaching students. The third I mentioned was saturation. And saturation is simply the amount of dilution of a hue by mixing achromatic light, such as gray or white. And basically what that means is if it's got lots of color, very little white light, very little gray, then that is very saturated. Those things that are less, or that have More white, more gray tend to be unsaturated. So one of the things I'd like you to think about, remember we talked about the bottom-up stimulation, the stimuli that impinge on our retinas, for example, or on sensory organs. And we talked about top-down processing, things like our expectations and the way we think about the world and interpret the world, that those produce perceptions. So with those things in mind, I want you to think about something. What color should a fire truck be? So traditionally, those fire trucks that most of us see tend to be red. But you may have noticed more recently that fire trucks have been more of this lime green, somewhere between lime and green, somewhere between yellow and green color, like this one over here. Which one do you think is better? Well, we'll return to that. I want to talk about a few things before I come back to my conclusion, but I'd be interested in knowing what your conclusion is too. Let's talk more about light. So light, as we mentioned, are waves of electromagnetic energy. And it turns out that there's all kinds of electromagnetic energy out there. We can only see a really small part of it. In fact, we can see somewhere between 400 and 700 nanometers. But if you look at this graphic, you can see over here, 10 to the negative 15th meters are called cosmic rays. We can't see those things. If we get a little bit shorter, no, a little bit longer, I should say, gamma rays, we still can't see those. X-rays that we use for taking a look at our images of bones and things like that, we can't see UV light. We can't see infrared. Those get longer, microwaves, etc. We can only see this little component in here. And this little component actually tends to be centered around things that we can see that are kind of greenish, which makes some sense. If we're trying to figure out things like the difference between rotted as well as fresh fruit, a fruit that's ready to be picked, ripe fruit, I guess I should say, etc. So you can look at our visual wavelength and you'll notice that it goes from all the way from red, sort of all the way here to blue or violet. And there's a way to remember this, and it's Roy G. Biv. So if we look at it from this perspective all the way back, Roy G. Biv is red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Finally, Roy G. Biv. And it starts on the actually longer end of the visual spectrum. But what's more, not only can't we see most of the visual spectrum, we're better at seeing certain parts of the visible spectrum. I should say, not only can't we see most of the electromagnetic spectrum, we're sensitive more to certain parts of the visible spectrum than to others. So this is kind of a map of that. You can begin to see that down here, this is our relative sensitivity to different kinds of wavelengths. Down here in the kind of violet area, we need a fair amount of energy in order for us to be able to detect things down in this area. On the other hand, we don't need much energy at all behind the stimulus in order for us to perceive things in this particular area. And then it drops off again as we get down towards orange and red and so forth. So we're particularly good at detecting information in our environment in these particular areas. Now, of course, things like the contrast, that is the information, what it's showing on and so forth, depends, also plays into, it comes into play here too. But we're better at detecting things in this range than over on these ranges. We mentioned our fovea, and on our fovea we have these neurotransmitters that we talked about, or these I should actually call them phototransmitters. So you can see these, I mentioned those types that we have are cones and rods. So here you can see our rod cells that look like rods and our cone cells that look like cones and so forth. Here's our blind spot and so on. And we mentioned that shortwave cones are most sensitive to light around 445 nanometers. So in other words, pretty short wavelengths. It also turns out that these short wave cones are pretty rare in our retina. There's only about 2% of the total cones are blue, that is short wave. They tend to be found outside the fovea, and remember it's the fovea that's the part that's kind of easiest for us to read things. When information falls or light energy falls on the retina, and in particular on the fovea, that's where we get the most distinct vision. Well, since there aren't many short wave cones, in fact no short wave cones in the fovea itself, it means we have a hard time getting really good detail when it's displayed in blue, especially fine detail, and I'll describe that in a minute. So most distinct information comes in the fovea, however we don't have blue cones in our fovea. You can begin to sort of see this when you look at these two pieces of information. Here's blue text on our left side, and as this thing becomes kind of smaller and smaller and finer, you'll notice that it becomes more and more difficult for people to read detailed blue text. And this isn't too bad of a display here. It's pretty good because there's good contrast and it's particularly good size. But on the other hand, if this gets smaller and if this sort of text ends up becoming more faint, we'll have more and more difficulty reading that blue text. That won't be the case for other kinds of text. So it also turns out that, remember there's rods and there's cones, but rods are much more numerous than cones. They're 1,000 times more light sensitive than cones, but they're not sensitive to color. So rods are what we use when we see, when we're seeing in the dark. Because they're not sensitive to color, and they are very light sensitive, however, they enable us to see things in the dark. It's just that everything we see in the dark tends to be kind of grayish, maybe a little darker. One piece will be a little darker than others, but they're all kinds of shades of gray. That's because that's because rods do not see color. And in fact, you can see the distribution of kind of sensitivities for 3 types of cones as well as rods here. So blue cones, you can see peak at this about 445 nanometer area. Green cones peak about this, it looks like 530 nanometer area. And red cones over here at about, what do you say, maybe 575. Notice the rods here. They're okay at detecting this area in here, but they don't even detect red at all down here. So rods don't see red at all. In fact, you can begin to see what's happening. I mentioned the differences between rods and cones in the fovea. You can see that cones are here in red, and there's lots and lots of cones, just no blue ones in the fovea. Rods, on the other hand, are over here outside the fovea at the periphery, basically, of the retina. So the eye contains about 120 million rods and only 6 million cones. So there's basically 20 rods for every cone. So while the visual acuity or resolution is better with cones, the rods tend to be better at sensing motion. They also predominate in our peripheral vision, and our peripheral vision is more light sensitive, enabling us to see objects in dimmer light. It's just that those objects tend to look gray instead of in color. As we mentioned, those rods tend to be sensitive to shorter wavelengths compared to daylight vision. You'll also notice, and you've seen this many times yourself, when you turn off the lights and suddenly are in the dark, it takes a while for your broad vision to ramp up, and that's called dark adaptation. Basically, it takes a while for you to start seeing for a bit before you really get used to it, and that's called dark adaptation. The same thing happens, of course, when you turn the lights on again and suddenly your your eyes begin to hurt, that is also a type of dark adaptation. So the optimum dark adaptation occurs after about 30 minutes or longer because it takes a while for the rods to adapt. And they tend to adapt much slower than cones do. You'll also notice that once we are dark adapted and then we turn on that light again, basically we lose that night vision quite a bit, and it takes us a long time for us to get it back. Now, the interesting thing about rods is since they don't see red, you can see they aren't sensitive to red at all. If you use red light instead of white light, and you can turn on that red light, well then you still stay dark adapted. And that's exactly what people do on ships and in jets and in things like that where they have to stay dark adapted. They use red light. So here's kind of a summary of these things and how they work. Basically, cones, there's few of them, whereas rods have many. The location of the cones, except for blue cones, tend to be in the fovea, where rods are in the periphery. Color perception is great for cones, but bad for rods, and light sensitivity is low for cones, but very high for rods. So you might ask again, basically, which should we want? Should we want a red fire truck, or should we want a green or yellowish fire truck? Well, if we look at our response sensitivity curves, it looks like, boy, something around here, greenish or so, looks like it would be perceived better than something over here, right? In fact, maybe a better way to show this is we tend to be more sensitive in this area than we are in this area. The other thing to notice is, remember, rods at nighttime don't see red at all. So all it sees basically at nighttime is this gray thing. And one of the things that ends up happening is people tend to run into fire trucks. So you'll be driving along, believe it or not, and you actually sometimes collide with fire trucks. Now that seems surprising, but it actually does happen, and people have found that when you switch to fire trucks that are this color, fewer people collide with them. Now you might wonder why in the world somebody would run into a fire truck since they have these lights on them and so forth. And we'll learn a little bit about obligatory cues, but basically the notion is that anytime there's movement in our visual periphery, we have a tendency to, it gets our attention basically. We have a tendency to look towards it. So if something's going on over here, I have a tendency to pay attention to it. Whether I like it or not, it's obligatory. It's an obligatory cue. So if you're driving along and lights come on relatively quickly when you didn't expect them, you have a tendency to do that. And that's what ends up happening is people have a tendency to turn a little bit when they look over here, just a little bit, and that's enough to run into a fire truck. So you're more likely to do that with these red guys than you are with these. Or what do we want to call them? Maybe yellow or green guys. Now, you also might say, well, but on the other hand, I really prefer the red because I'm used to fire trucks being red, and red stands for warning, and red stands for fire, and red stands for danger, and all that other kind of business, and that's true. That's the difference between top-down and bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing, well, it enables us to see these a little bit better. Top-down processing enables us to recognize these as fire trucks a little bit better. I'm going to pass over that. There are a number of functions available for you on the web that enable you to design for people who have some type of color deficiency. So about 8 to 10% of males have some type of color deficiency, red, green, or blue, yellow deficiencies, and this enables you to choose and see how different shades would be seen by people with different types of color blindness. So a lot of people ask me, you know, color is so powerful in design. What are some good ways to make sure that you're not overusing color in your designs? And what some kind of simple rules of thumb that I have for people is to make sure they design for monochrome first. One of the things you'll learn as we walk through this sensation and perception lecture is that a number of things like sheer proximity, how close things are to one another, are really important cues for how related they are. So just white space and grouping and information like that, what goes next to each other, is really powerful. And it's always best to use that first, and then to use color redundantly with those things, and we'll talk about those as we go along. The other part is I tend to use color fairly sparingly, so that basically a couple of reasons. Color tends to attract our attention so much. Sometimes it's attracting attention to things we don't want to attract attention to. And the other thing is, if you use lots of different colors, things end up looking a bit like a birthday party. And you don't usually want to do that with most of your designs. It's also critical that you use enough contrast, and we'll come back and talk about contrast in this sensation and perception lecture as well. But contrast is basically the difference between what's in the foreground and what's in the background. So basically the difference in luminance, which we'll describe, between the sort of foreground, as you can see here, the text, and the background. So here we have not the greatest contrast, not bad though, because we have a difference between the black text and the gray background. If we wanted more contrast, we would eliminate that gray background to just a white background, which would provide even more contrast, make it easier to see this from across the room as opposed to right in front of us. So I think I'll stop this lecture here, and we'll move on to other things regarding vision in just a few moments.